One of my goals with Backvlog is to share not just an eventual catalogue of completed games, but also to share my experiences and interactions with various forms of media. In the first 2 episodes, I focused on 2 games from franchises that evoke a strong sense of nostalgia, as they are already beloved and familiar to me. However, in this video, I want to explore something a bit different. Threads of Fate is a game that didn't catch my attention until nearly 2 decades after its release, which came as quite a shock to me, considering my deep appreciation for Squaresoft's games during my upbringing. Or at least, it was a shock until I consider the fact that I live in the UK. There were a lot of Square games we didn't get, Threads of Fate being one of them. For context for those who don't live in the UK, Final Fantasy VII was the first proper Final Fantasy game we got here. We missed out on Xenogears, and Super Mario RPG didn't see release here until the Virtual Console release in 2008. These titles, and many more, I had the opportunity to catch up on through re-releases and emulation over the years. Threads of Fate piqued my curiosity when it was mentioned in a forum thread about obscure games. I mean, need I say more? It was a game I hadn't heard of before from a developer I loved. In scenarios like this, you could be looking at a hidden gem, or a disappointment, and that alone creates intrigue. But what really sold me on wanting to give this game a try was when I learned many of the same staff who worked on Xenogears also had a hand working on this game. Xenogears is easily in my top 5 games of all time. That's how you know how much of a train wreck human being I am. But in all seriousness, I feel any game sharing its pedigree is surely worth checking out. So let's do just that. Threads of Fate, known as Do Prism in Japan, is an action RPG released in 1999 for the PS1. The story revolves around 2 main characters, Rue and Mint, who journey in search of an ancient relic capable of granting any wish. Upon starting the game, you are presented with a choice to play as either character. Rue, a mysterious and determined boy, driven by his desire to bring back someone important to him. Mint, a self-centered princess who finds herself unexpectedly disinherited from her throne in favour of her younger sister, Maya. Fueled by anger, she sets out on a relentless pursuit to find the relic, driven by her ambition to use its power to conquer the world. Both stories will have you visiting the same places and bumping into the same characters along the way. What distinguishes the 2 playthroughs is the unique perspective, dialogue exchanges, and distinct gameplay mechanics that each character offers. The game is set in Corona, a serene and quaint town which serves as the central hub of the game. Regardless of which character you choose to play as first, your adventure will begin in Corona Forest. Here, you'll familiarise yourself with the game's mechanics. It's also where you begin to encounter a diverse cast of characters, some of whom are there to assist you on your quest, while others are in competition for the same goal, finding the relic. I will say up front, the game isn't that long. Completing each character's storyline will probably take you around 4 to 6 hours. Despite that, the story is simple yet effectively presented. It succeeds in creating a sense of depth and immersion by portraying a world that feels well lived. Characters frequently refer to other locations and recall past encounters, giving the impression of a vibrant, interconnected world beyond Corona. In the end, when the game starts planting its sequel hooks, it does get me quite excited at seeing more of this world. I think the downsides here is that the story really doesn't get all that interesting until you're nearly 2/3 done with it. Let's touch on gameplay. As mentioned earlier, Threads of Fate is an action RPG as simple as they come really. You're just bashing enemies. Rue primarily relies on his sword for combat, but he possesses a unique ability to transform into various monsters he encounters. This transformation not only grants him their abilities in combat, but also aids in solving puzzles throughout the game. Defeating a monster will cause it to drop a coin, which Rue can collect and store in his transformation menu. He can hold up to 4 different forms at a time. Once transformed, Rue's sword abilities are replaced with entirely new ones. Each monster form alters Rue's speed, weight, and jump height, creating a distinct and refreshing gameplay experience. For example, you can transform into a hovering creature to navigate hazardous floors, leap over large gaps, or even become a big handsome fella capable of smashing giant boulders. While this mechanic is enjoyable, it feels somewhat underutilized. Because Rue's combat is incredibly simplistic, I was under the impression this was to give the monster form some more weight and relevance as they essentially open Rue's move pool up. And while it kind of does this, they can largely be ignored. The game is far too easy. Rue can dispatch most enemies with ease, and due to the limitation of only holding 4 monster forms at once, there isn't much room for favoritism. Whenever a new coin is collected, it automatically replaces the oldest coin in rotation. The puzzles and obstacles in the games are specifically designed with the abilities of the local monsters in mind, leaving little incentive to bring along a preferred monster from a different area. Overall, the simplicity of Rue's combat and the limited utilization of the monster forms contribute to the game's relatively easy nature. While the transformation mechanic is enjoyable, I feel it could have been further integrated into the gameplay to provide more depth and strategic choices. Meanwhile, Mint, while able to fight fairly well with her chakram, relies mostly on her magic abilities. Magic is distinguished by several colours and effects that Mint can mix and match to create different attacks. The simplest way to describe it, colour is the elemental property while effects are the form that magic takes. For instance, you could opt for white magic and then choose the normal effect for a steady stream of shots, or wide for a broader arc of projectiles in front of you. This mix and match approach is really quite fun, and it's quite the opposite approach to Rue, which makes Mint a lot more fun to play. Unlike Rue, Mint has access to these colours and effects at any time across the game. Over the course of her playthrough, you'll gradually unlock access to all colour magic, but some of the effects will require a bit of searching. However, the effort for finding them is truly worthwhile and enhances the overall experience, making any required backtracking a far more rewarding endeavour. Compared to Rue's story, I felt that by the end of Mint's story I had a more complete RPG experience, where I had developed the character and had a bit more of an arsenal of abilities to deal with enemies. This only feels noteworthy to mention due to the absence of a traditional level up system. Instead, character progression is a lot more organic. HP increases as you receive damage, while MP increases the more you use it. There also isn't a traditional inventory system. So instead of buying potions to heal yourself, enemies will occasionally drop recovery items. In addition to this, you can recover MP by attacking enemies. Both systems feed into one another quite nicely, meaning you never really need to concern yourself with running short on HP or MP, and the more you fight to regain HP and MP, the more your characters will grow. I think it's pretty cool, but I think they missed a trick in not applying this to the strength and defense stats. Unlike HP and MP, you can only raise these stats with weapon and armor upgrades that you purchase throughout the game, or purchase stat upgrades for an expensive fee. Despite this, because of how streamlined everything is, there is a good chance you'll have enough money to buy each weapon and armor upgrade as they become available throughout the game. So it's not like it's difficult to keep pace with the rest of the game. Heck, even the previously mentioned stat upgrades aren't really necessary at all. The word that keeps coming to mind here is simple. There's nothing oppressively difficult, but there's also nothing challenging enough to keep me engaged. It does sometimes feel like I'm just meandering through to get to the next story beat. The only time the game borders on frustrating is with the platforming, which this game has, for some reason. The best way I can sum up my thoughts on this is to talk about the level Mel's Atelier. When looking at general reviews and comments about this game online, a fairly common sentiment I kept coming across was that this part of the game was torture for a lot of young players who grew up with it. You set off to Mel's and suddenly there's this abrupt transition where one moment you're running through the forest and the next you're in a psychedelic pastel cotton candy world. I like this, it reminds me of a Kirby level. We come here to ask a witch called Mel for her help, but she's not here. So these little guys, her helpers, want to play mini-games. To get to the mini-games you have to go through these timed platforming stages, and they're not so great. I was really struggling with this, especially this part where you have to jump from the top of this ball to the next platform. The jumping controls just don't feel very smooth or responsive. The other issue I faced during my first playthrough was when I went through this section with Rue. On some platforms, there were enemies blocking the way, and you had to defeat them to land on the platform. To do this, you had to transform into the Imp and use magic. The Imp could handle most jumps, so I thought it was intended that I could complete the challenge with the Imp transformation. However, this was wrong, because while the imp could make most jumps, there was this one particular jump where it didn't cover enough distance. I only realised this during my Mint playthrough. Both Mint and Rue can jump far enough to cover that distance, so you only need to turn into the imp to eliminate these enemies. This made this part tedious as Rue, but once I knew how to navigate these sections and only had to think about playing as Rue with no transformations to worry about, it was pretty straightforward. But I think that highlights one of the big problems for the game for me. For a first time playthrough, transformations are this big variable that I'm prone to overthink. It feels like it should be a much bigger deal and see more use throughout the whole game, but it ends up not really being factored in all that much. Which is a shame because this feels like this should have been a standout moment for the game. The aesthetic of the area is really out there compared to everything else in the game, which adds to the weirdness and charm of Mel herself. Anyway, you help Mel by finding her little helper and she helps you in return. It's also the first time the game starts to properly deviate, with Rue and Mint getting their own exclusive levels. I really like this aspect, but I really wish we could have seen more deviations like this throughout the game, or at the very least, more alternative routes through levels, just to distinguish each playthrough and not make it feel so samey. Rue's story has its merits, with some intricate details that I genuinely enjoyed. However, I must admit that I found it somewhat cliché overall. It explores themes of identity and the sacrifices one is willing to go through, but if you're familiar with Square RPGs at this time, you may not find anything particularly unique about it. On the other hand, Mint's story is an absolute comedic gem, and it almost feels like a parody of the typical JRPG narrative. Despite Mint being a selfish brat with aspirations of conquering the world, we come to learn that she does have a compassionate side and a desire to do what's right. The most amusing aspect was witnessing her confront the story's villains while adamantly asserting that they had no right to take over the world because it was her destiny to do so. Threads of Fate is incredibly simple, and that is by design. When Koji Sugimoto, the game's director, started on its development, he had two specific goals in mind. First, he wanted to create an action RPG that could be played by children or those of a low skill level. He wanted to craft a bright and happy game, steering away from darker or scarier themes. This was partially encouraged after his work on Xenogears, whose story dealt with much darker and mature subject matter, which he felt children wouldn't understand. I feel this is noteworthy to mention because it speaks to the point in time that Threads of Fate was made under. Koji Sugimoto and Squaresoft, by extension, were working on games with darker or more mature subject matter, things that might be too complicated or alienating for children to enjoy or be fully immersed in. Given that the late 90s and early 2000s were full of many an edgy game or two, it makes sense that he had concerns around cultivating a future player base. While I don't feel his concerns were entirely warranted, given that games for a younger audience still came out, I do feel I have to acknowledge that's probably due to people like him. In an industry that still to this day chases trends, it's kind of nice that he was thinking about younger players that could have been left behind in a frenzy of the industry wanting to validate itself as being more mature. Secondly, as a programmer himself, his other goal was to create a fully 3D game. He mentions that Square had not developed many fully 3D games at this point. They had either made games with 3D characters and 2D backgrounds or vice versa, but never a fully 3D game world. I think the goals behind this project at the time was very admirable. I'm an absolute sucker for this low poly early 3D game look. So to me, the visuals of this game are incredibly charming, and while not a cinematic masterpiece by any stretch, there is some nice camera work and tweaks of emotion and movement from the characters that help sell you on the story at certain points, and jokes are punctuated with excellent timing. The trickiest thing with playing and writing about this game has been the fact that I just didn't experience it the way that many others have done. For me, everything the game accomplishes, I've seen done 1,000 times by other games. And yet, when I did my research for this video, I read so many reviews and comments from people who grew up with it, from people for whom this game was a formative experience, who have so many fond memories and hold this game close to their hearts. I understand this feeling, because the games I've covered previously were exactly that for me. Overall, I did enjoy the time I spent with Threads of Fate. Rue's character, while telling a heartfelt story, did feel a little flat and boring to me. Mint and her ambitious, egotistic personality provided more than enough entertainment to balance this out. The graphics and character designs were excellent, giving life to a fun, fascinating world with a compelling narrative. I really enjoyed the soundtrack, and during my research I found out that the music was composed by Junya Nakano, who later worked on Final Fantasy X. In this interview he stated, quote, "If Dew Prism did not exist, the music of a Final Fantasy X could have been completely different from what it is right now. I acquired great experiences through working on the music of Dew Prism." That sentiment got me thinking. The same could be said for the art or the writing of many other games that came after Threads of Fate. The game's talented staff members went on to contribute to numerous other well-known projects. For example, Tadahiro Yasuda, one of the game's artists, joined Monolith Soft after working on this game. Similarly, Daisuke Watanabe, the scenario writer, continued his journey at Square Enix, where he contributed to the later Final Fantasy titles and even the Kingdom Hearts series. So while playing this game today didn't blow me away, I can still appreciate its presence, the influence it had, and the way it defined itself that made it so memorable to so many.